All right, so welcome to the March Emerging Centers Campus Research Computing Consortium call. Today we're going to talk about, have a little community discussion about some affinity groups we're trying to start up. The steering committees talked about this quite a bit in the last couple meetings, and we want to kind of give everyone an update as to what we're currently thinking and give some feedback, and then take that feedback and continue moving this effort forward. So for those of you that are new to PEARC, Campus Computing Research Consortium, we're an organization that advances the frontiers of research by improving the effectiveness of research computing and data professionals like us, including career development, visibility, and the ability to deliver services to researchers. There's a couple different parts of CARC. This is part of the People Network. We're emerging centers, and there's a bunch of other tracks: researcher-facing, systems-facing, data-facing, and strategy and policy-facing. If any of those sound like that might be something of interest to you, go to our website, carc.org, and feel free to sign up to get info on the other tracks as well. We also have some interest groups that focus around certain topics of interest for research computing professionals. We have some working groups. The working groups tend to have some kind of deliverable that they're working towards. We have a couple of those right now, and then we have our operations groups that keep everything running smoothly, like creating these beautiful opening slides. This is the Emerging Centers track. Like I said, the People Network. That's what you're currently participating in. We're in a community of campus professionals who support research computing and researchers that use them. Again, talked about a couple different tracks, and there's more information at that URL below if you want to sign up for any of the other, to get information on any of the other tracks. This is the Emerging Centers track. That's our steering committee members. I'm Pat Clemens, one of the co-coordinators. Jason Sims couldn't make it today, but he's one of the other ones. And then the rest of the committee, we were the ones that have been talking about these affinity groups and kind of pushing this forward, and you'll hear some of our thoughts in a second here. We have a code of conduct. We want to provide a welcoming, supportive environment for all participants, and the code of conduct sets forth the guidelines for the behavior of all participants. There's a link below to the full code of conduct, but the general gist is that we want to, again, make things supportive and inclusive. There's resolution procedures to encourage participants to report examples of behavior that you think may be in violation of that code of conduct. And by participating here today, you accept the shared priority of abiding by this code of conduct. All right, to get involved, your mailing lists, events, you can email the coordinators at that email and other CARC groups, and then we have a help email as well. So plenty of opportunities to get involved more deeply, volunteering on a call panel, on the steering committees, all kinds of good stuff. So if that sounds of interest, let me know, and I can get you hooked up with the right people. So any questions before we move forward with today's agenda? All right, sounds great. So I'm going to stop this slideshow and move to my next one. All right, so this is meant to be a discussion. So if anything sounds of interest or have a comment, anything that you see, we really are looking for great feedback. So this is what we're calling our affinity groups. Again, so the name itself is up for discussion. We're calling them affinity groups. That's kind of what the name we came up with, but you'll see that it's not quite the typical use of that term. So give you a bit of a background on how this got started. So we had birds of a feather at PEARC24 with the Emerging Centers group, and it was well attended. We had over 60 participants, great discussion. Three themes kind of came out of that from what I could gather. One was broader participation on the Emerging Centers Steering Committee. We've been working on that. We have a couple new steering committee members, all from smaller institutions. We were kind of R1 heavy, and we realized that, so we kind of wanted to move away from some of that steering committee membership and move towards some representation from smaller schools. So I think we've done a decent job with that. We're still working on that as well, recruiting some new steering committee members. So that sounds of interest, let me know. The one we're going to talk about most today is there was a big discussion about emerging centers feeling more like part of the club. And there was this kind of general sense that R1s had kind of some additional resources, and they had kind of different groups that they could participate in and chat with each other and form a community. And it wasn't that those were inaccessible to the small institutions, but there was just a lack of knowledge about them, and kind of the community didn't feel like it was the right fit for some of these small institutions that were a little bit less resourced. And so today we're going to talk about some kind of our first effort towards making the smaller, our emerging centers feel more like a community. And then the third was helping growing our centers through stories, and the kind of the effort to address that. We have our first set of origin stories in April. So next month we have a researcher talking to us about how they kind of grew their center. And we're gonna have a series of these origin stories coming up over the next couple months. Not every month, but like we're gonna kind of intersperse it in there and kind of give folks these stories. We realize that there's less of a guidebook to growing and more of like guidelines. And so these origin stories are designed to see how other people have grown their centers of their own institutions. So those are the three main discussion themes. Again, today we're going to talk about number 2. So our vision for addressing number 2. So we wanted to create, instead of trying to like shoehorn ourselves into existing clubs, we kind of want to create our own to create community around emerging centers. And the idea around these affinity groups is not to have like necessarily structured talks and speakers. That's kind of what our monthly calls are for. We wanted more unstructured space time, more personal discussions, kind of like, you know, a discussion among peers. So very peer oriented, not about teaching or learning necessarily or mentoring, but more about listening, sharing, and engaging with each other, sharing kind of you know, the day-to-day things that make us crazy, and hopefully kind of sharing those common challenges and even our common successes. The intention of these is not to record them like we do with our monthly calls, but and un-AI'd, you know, so no like AI record, you know, note takers or anything like that. But again, to kind of enable the free flow of conversation. And so to maybe put this more just concretely, some of the metaphors and comparisons we thought of were like pen pals, like back to grade school or middle school, right? You had pen pals where you could kind of easily exchange information, but it was very personable, kind of talked about your daily life. It was less about, you know, the like professional development and more about creating community. Book clubs, you know, the whole, you know, gather around the water cooler for random conversation, peer coaching, dinner party-ish kind of things. That's what we kind of had in mind with these affinity groups. So again, less structured, less formal, and definitely smaller sized. So a lot of our calls tend to be, you know, in the 20s or more if it's a popular topic. It's kind of hard to kind of build that personal relationship, even sometimes feel comfortable to speak up. The idea of this is that you would know your affinity group much more intimately. It's more of a place for personal conversation. So that's kind of what we have in mind. So to further that, our agenda today, and again, feel free to speak up and as I go through this, but we kind of talked about 3 main pieces as to like how we might foster these affinity groups. So one is what personal potential affinities, like what kind of, to create a community, there kind of needs to be a common shared, you know, interest. And so what might some of those interests or affinities be? How are we going to form these groups? The format. So how are these groups going to meet? What activities are we going to have to engage in and encourage this group formation? And then kind of the community, like what are these groups going to look like? Who's going to be part of the affinity groups? How are we going to establish community expectations? so on and so forth. So that's kind of the agenda broken into these three kind of main topics. Sound good so far? All right. So potential affinities. So again, in the spirit of, making these informal and kind of trying to make them organic, ground up, one affinity just might be availability. We might have certain affinity groups that meet certain days of the week at certain times, and maybe the one that you're available for is the one that you attend. So folks are available on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern, that's the Monday affinity group. And there might be a Tuesday at 6 a.m. or if you're a morning person. So one affinity just might be when people are available. Another affinity might be size, mission, or type of institution. So even within, the general category of emerging centers, there's quite a few subcategories. So there's those of us that are at HBCUs or MSIs that serve underrepresented groups. EPSCoR is another kind of size/mission type of institution. It could be something around, universities and institutions that specialize in like environmental science or that are more engineering oriented or tech oriented. And then with the new Carnegie reclassification, there's a whole bunch of new R1s that weren't R1s before, that are kind of like, they're just reaching that new threshold. So maybe that's another affinity, these R1s that are just graduating into that classification with the revised Carnegie classification scheme. So that might be another affinity, any of those, it's type of institution. It was brought up, another affinity might be specific technologies. So this one gets to be a little bit more, around potentially like training or professional development. But things around like containers, maybe folks that use Slurm on a daily basis, or AI is very big now and pretty general. Maybe there's a affinity group around how their researchers are using AI and what kind of equipment purchases and and software challenges are coming out of that. And then a lot of us use OpenHPC as well as an open source uh, product and community. Maybe we have an affinity group around folks that use OpenHPC. So this could be a technology bend to this, and we could, find groups around certain technologies. Again, to make it less formal, we could be around extracurricular activities. At PEARC, we often see groups that kind of come together around, home brewing or photography or music or an interest in history and culture. So there's a bunch of like other activities that we all do in our real lives outside of work. And maybe we can have affinity groups around that. And that could be the start of an affinity group. And then finally, one thing that a lot of groups have done is around geography. And I put the RENs, the regional exchange networks in here as well. They're kind of, because they're typically regional by geography. We could have affinity groups that are all connected to the same regional network, or all the ones, in a certain region of the country. Like, I'm from Vermont, so I'm going to say like New England, institutions. So these are all kind of different ways that we thought that we could form these kind of at least a seed of commonality to have these affinity groups grow from. Before I move on, are there any other ideas of potential things to form affinity groups around? Are we on the right track? Thoughts?
Yeah, I think another area would be possibly support areas. So cryo-EM or storage solutions. So support would be one area, and governance and policy might be another. How to do secure enclaves and things like that. Because I think there's parts to it of it's a microcosm of the people network. So there's sort of systems, there's policy, there's researcher facing kinds of things. So that might be another area to ponder.
Yes, I agree. Um, I again, I think having things formed around things we do at work are great, and I think that can provide a seed. But I'm also very interested in affinities that have less to do about our professional life and more about creating a community that we all do the same thing at work, but we all have things that we do outside of work as well. So yeah. But I do agree. I think because we're all here because we're research computing and data professionals, something to provide that seat around something at work is definitely something that might be the easiest bench threshold to cross at first.
Well, there's also the archive group, which is a
Hmm.
blend of imaging scientists and medievalists doing that kind of thing. So it could be research areas or
Yes.
research affinities of the physicists, the anthropologists, whatever, could be another space that would fall. And that one actually would be an interesting bridge to like meeting at some of the discipline specific, like um, the physics society kind of thing of,
Yeah, that's true. Right.
bonding it to discipline with research computing. Because I think sometimes it's uh, in an emerging center, you have a new faculty member who just came on and is doing genomics. And how do I support this person? So this might be a good sort of linchpin for some of those.
Yeah, yeah. I like that idea.
So, um, quick question on this is related not specifically to specific technologies, although given how many times I get called on, this might be an extracurricular activity for me. But especially when it comes to like emerging institutions or new institutions or underserved institutions, the development of like, grants, projects, cyber infrastructure, things like that, would be useful for those of us that have been, gone through it, been successful, might be able to provide, kind of like a guidance or just a place for people to bounce ideas around saying like, how do you do this? How do you do that? How do you get questions on it? So like kind of a community support for, development of grants and grant solicitations or
I like
grant
that
responses
idea.
and funding initiatives, given especially how much harder it may be to get through
Yeah.
that
Please
maze
check,
these days.
check the chat. There's a call document link in there. I'm trying to collect ideas over there for affinity groups. So if you think it's at all useful, I wrote down Kirk's more or less. So as we're talking things out, let's throw some in there as well, because I'm not gonna summarize as accurately
Sure.
as some of y'all are.
I saw some others in there for you, Mike. If you could organize those while I
Yep.
chat. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a great idea, Michael. I like that a lot. Grant writing is a big deal. It's challenging. Most of us aren't coming from like a research background where we've done that our whole lives, and I think that's a really good spot.
Yeah, I mean, and aside on that could even be, obviously people would have to, if they participated in this way, not be a grant reviewer for a particular grant, but in some cases it might even be useful for people to have
Yeah,
almost like a mini panel to kind of go through and get feedback on, they put it in there, But obviously there may be uh confidentiality and things like that that would have to be addressed for it specifically, but might be useful, especially for emerging institutions if this is our first one or two out of the gate.
yeah, 100%. That was also actually a pretty big topic of discussion at the PEARC24 BoF was about grants, and so we've been trying to think about how to integrate that. So this might be a nice um, um, a nice convergence point between integrating that desire for more discussion around grants and then also kind of building a peer community.
Whoever Patrick had noted for storage, was that just basically keeping a handle on storage in general? Or I mean, Was it,
I
was
would-
it, was there something with the
yeah.
cryo-EM specifically with storage?
No,
Or,
I would put that with 2 as another specific hardware technology or instrument. It was just another like topic area around hardware. Exactly. Thanks. All right, great. This is great feedback. Okay, so next thing we wanted to kind of talk about around this was kind of format. So how these look, and we came up with a bunch of different ideas, and this could be a combination of any or all of these, but this is kind of what we came up with at first. So the general idea was, an initial one was to have like a separate meeting time to be determined by the affinity group. Us as emerging centers is volunteer driven, and there's no way that we foresee being able to kind of manage and schedule and deal with the intricacies of like multiple affinity groups. So the idea is that we would foster them, get them going, figure out ways to like get people to meet. We can provide a Zoom channel for folks to meet at, and then kind of have them evolve on their own. So there would be so the first idea would like to have a separate meeting. The pro to this is that there's a separate space. We can kind of like invite and have attendance be more regulated or more controlled. The con is that it's yet another meeting on your calendar, and I know that some folks are pretty, exhausted with like their meeting schedule, and maybe another meeting isn't what they want. So one idea, one option is to have these separate meeting spaces. We can also integrate the affinity call groups into an occasional monthly call. So much like we're going to do with the origin stories, every once in a while we can have a monthly call that was based around our affinity groups. The idea was that we could use like breakout groups to host multiple affinity groups at one time. The pro for this is that it's not another meeting. The con is that logistics is a little more challenging. We have to figure out the breakout groups, figure out which affinity groups are going to meet that month, and kind of like precede those breakout rooms. It's not a horrible ordeal, but again, it's a little bit more logistics. It would also then take up monthly call times, and we might want to use those more for speakers and broader discussions. So again, pros and cons with taking up monthly calls to do the affinity group thing. We could do a combination of above. So one idea we had was that, well, we could do like maybe an affinity call generation thing, like once a year, twice a year at our monthly calls. And the idea would be that we would, provide a space for affinity groups to like kind of find critical mass, recruit new members, find new topics to form affinity groups around. And so these would be a good way to host new groups. It wouldn't take up a ton of our monthly calls. It would provide a common space to kind of, I guess, throw everyone in the pot of stew and see, who coagulates together in these affinity groups. That's kind of the idea with these, with this one. And then the last one kind of takes a different context onto that combination. And that's to use an unconference format. And CARC has done this with a couple other initiatives within CARC. And the idea for the unconference is that you kind of show up, you pick a couple topics, gauge interest, and then dynamically form breakout groups around those topics. And so we can either, again, do this in an occasional monthly call, or we can make this part of like the end of each monthly call where, we open it up to say, okay, so here's our affinity group time. What topics are at the top of your mind that you would like to have some peers to engage with around? And we can spend the last couple minutes of each call trying to, kind of form these affinity groups and seeing if there's, again, critical mass around certain topics. So all of those are potential formats that we thought about as ways to foster these affinity groups. Any thoughts, comments, ideas? Yeah, Amy.
Yeah, just a thought about, how the affinity groups and monthly calls might intersect. And I put this in chat as well. But, we might consider, rather than spending part of the monthly call time doing affinity group breakouts, it rather invite one of the affinity groups to be a speaker at a monthly call about what has been coming up in the affinity group, right? Especially for those that are more technology specific or the specific legal constraints or things like that. You might, I know it can be difficult to corral speakers for the monthly calls in any case at some time. So, it might serve two purposes that way.
Yes. Thank you. We definitely had that idea as well. I thought I captured that in here, but I do not see it. But yes, I agree. I think that's a great idea.
Amy, please add that. Unless that's what Patrick's doing, yeah.
I'm doing that right now, yeah.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on format? I might go about doing this.
Well, maybe it's also getting a birds of a feather at PEARC and supercomputing to do a physical unconference to maybe, set the year's agenda in flight of, hey, we really need to deal with this, that, or the other thing. Because I think the unconference is a great way to sort of assemble and then sort of go off and come back kind of thing.
That's a great idea. I also think too, Kirk, one other comment you made earlier, made me think this as well. I think having an in-person component of these affinity groups, or as much as we would be able to, is a huge benefit to building community. It's really hard to do it virtually, and having like a annual or semi-annual touch point in person makes those connections much, much stronger. And that's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to build with these. I know what it was when you talked about around different research focus areas and going around the conferences for those research areas. So maybe people could meet at like neuroscience or astronomical society, so on and so forth, to provide that in-person kind of connection. I like that idea.
Well, we might be able to also leverage REN meetings
Oh yeah,
to, ask them to give us, could you have a half hour, get together or, a happy hour kind of thing on, either ends of the thing or a breakfast part.
Yeah.
Maybe ask some of our RENs to give a bit of a bootstrap to say, you guys are doing research and education. Let's partner up to share a little bit. Because I think that's the one where the RENs have physical meetings, we have physical meetings, discipline
Yeah.
have physical meetings. So maybe just seeding that initial kickoff point, because then those could spawn off by way of these kinds of meetings to sort of say, hey, NYSERDAD had their conference and, we're talking about a thing.
Yes, 100%.
Amy's got another one.
Yeah, go for it.
Thinking about what Kurt Can just mentioned in terms of, the REN meetings or the disciplinary meetings, something that I've seen happen within disciplinary meetings when it comes to library services is that there will often be a subgroup within that discipline space for librarians who specialize within that discipline. And something similar, something parallel to that, or even crossed with that might be of interest to, those who are, supporting this service area to that particular discipline and considering those particular needs of the discipline as well.
Yes, I 100%. Great idea.
I was gonna say, I raised my hand mostly because I'm just impressed that I figured out how to do the raise hand again thing, because I never used to do it. So it always takes me about 15 minutes, but I felt like I had to like do it. This is maybe a little bit of a wider kind of a CARC evangelization issue. But we're talking about RENs, we're talking about PEARC, all the various SC, all the various conferences and things like that. I think what would probably be, might not be a bad idea longer term with CARC is almost having a very definitive CARC presence at most of these things. And even like if you have people that are in a particular REN, like, my REN's NYSERNet, maybe myself and one or two other people who come to these meetings as much as we can, work with NYSERNet to almost have like a CARC table or a CARC whatever at these places. And so CARC shows up, but then you bring the affinity groups along with it. So like those people could be almost like, on the ground regional, evangelists that can help introduce people that are not as aware of it, introduce the idea of the affinity groups, help the affinity groups get together. It's, kind of distributing the load across the community. And then at the bigger ones, obviously if you're at SC or something like that, and I mean, I don't know what it costs to do any of these things, but even just carving out like a small area. I know a couple of the RENs last year, 23 when I was at SC, had a space where they were not necessarily doing a thing so much as put an area for people to just like sit down and chat. And
Yeah.
it may not be a bad idea to see if CARC or some other way or, can help, sponsor those things. So I think if, it might be a, a helpful way of kind of, spreading it out there at all the conferences that we're going to. And if we know with that kind of evangelist core, okay, these number of people are going to be at SC. Let's see if they can get together and coordinate something there so the load is not all on just the central CARC people,
Right.
and stuff like that. And it may just be an idea of just getting things out there. And
Yeah.
definitely CARC stickers are there. I'm just saying go to the next level, just have a tattoo artist and get your CARC tattoo at a conference. I mean, why, go big or go home, Lauren, but I just, but I think it might work out really, really well. To see if we can, kind of push that.
Yeah. Yeah. So at the last perk, there was a CARC table and they sponsored coffee 1 or 2 mornings. And I felt that was heavily successful and just like having, like you said, having a place to kind of like chill out between sessions or to find other people and build community. And yeah, I don't know that they've done that at SC. Can't remember. But
We have.
I okay, good. I do like the idea of having like that kind of common space. I was recently at another disciplinary meeting, AGU, and part of like a subsection of that. And we had like a little daily meetup and they had these little like sofa pods. And I was blown away by how popular that daily meetup was, even though we were a small group and kind of like a niche area within AGU. We had like, 6 to 8 people show up every single day for like an hour just to chit chat and like take a break from the conference. So yeah, I do think we underestimate the power of just having that like kind of space for people to go and kind of take a break from the conference and just engage on a much more informal way. Oh, hey, Lauren.
Hey, I wanted to plus one some things. So CARC has for the last, I don't know, for as long as PEARC has existed, but also for the last several years at SC, partnered with Internet 2, or rather Internet 2 has sponsored including us in their booth. And then we've done coffee with CARC, where we've provided donuts or baked goods and coffee for people to kind of stop by on one particular morning at both of those events. I think we're going to try to continue that, and it would be through an Internet 2 contribution for the most part. I like the idea of doing something with the RENs too. I think the question is, who wants to coordinate that on the kind of larger scale, right? Who wants to, do we need to coordinate with the RENs directly? Do we need to, with each REN meeting, have somebody who's looking out for when those happen and then solicits folks from the people network who are going to be there to see if they want to get together at some point? I think it's really about how we organize around that.
Now that I figured it out, I'm completely addicted to raising my hand for things now. I don't have to.
It is fun.
So it's just like a thing. It's like a new skill I got to use. One of the things related to that, Lauren, is I don't know I think at various Rens, there's different levels of engagement between Kark and other places and that particular Ren. And I think if there was one or two Kark active people within each Ren that could probably coordinate with the Rens directly and help sell the idea that that Kark helps foster engagement with other people that may not be in their Ren. And then and that may bring them into like getting into places that they haven't necessarily been into, or helping facilitate people that they're trying to bring online, because a lot of us have done these things. So if we can tie to some of the Rens, or all of the Rens, the idea that Kark itself is a value add to their community and facilitates things for them, and it's something they can hand off, because a lot of them are in the business of doing, here's your network hookup, here's your whatever, here's your, like that. And the kind of soft hand-holdy thing, that, Kark can kind of do, and getting engagement and getting the right people together and talking about that because of the community may be a value add for them as well. And at the same time, then they might be willing to like sponsor that table or give us the space and do the things that we need to. And then, in places that, it helps us then put people in contact with their Rens and facilitate some of that. So I think we've got to just kind of find one or two pains in the asses within each Ren who are just willing to run them down.
Yeah, and I also wonder, you're getting me thinking about other things too. So you just said one or two folks with the Rens. I put in the chat like Ren reps to Kark. Like that could be a semi-official thing.
Yeah.
There could be a group of Ren reps. The other thing that you
Like
just
Ren
triggered,
is like campus champions for Rens and Kark champions for Rens. It's like,
yeah.
I know it's a bad way. Okay, just, take it in the spirit of it.
I take it in the spirit, lowercase champions, right? Not that there's any issue
Yeah,
with the
got it.
campus champions. I think we don't want to take their term, right?
Yeah, no, I know that.
But the thing that you also triggered in my mind is that the Rens all coordinate through the quilt. And I know that a number of them, and as a group, have talked about how they better engage researchers, where RCD professionals are a really critical access point at a lot of campuses, right? Not all campuses have, folks who would identify as RCD professionals, or who, by being one of those, are connected to something like Kark. But there's a lot of gateway opportunities here, right?
Yeah,
A lot of megaphone opportunities.
and thinking about like recently, like Quilt often co-locates the campus CC Star
Right.
programs with the NSF. So, if
Mhm.
we're working with the Rens and Quilt and Kark is there, especially for people when they're getting into their new grant, luckily they got it. So now the bad thing about getting a grant is that now I've got it. Now what the heck do I do with it? It may be a way to have Kark even be able to be a presenter at some of those things and open that door a little bit more.
Agreed. Dana also just threw in something.
Yes, so I had actually raised my hand. So I've been, I work with Lauren and for Dana at Internet 2, and I've been running a BoF at the, we have two annual meetings, a communications exchange and a technical exchange. And there is one coming up in Anaheim at the end of this month. And I've been having a BoF to bring in regional network providers and talk about the research and how they support research, and what they're doing at that level. Last year, we had a pretty good showing, and Amy Apon was there, and so it's a really good way to kind of have them come and tell their story. So I would encourage you, if any of you all will be at the communications exchange this year, that you check that out. It's going to be on Tuesday evening.
Great. Lauren, do you have something else?
Yeah, maybe just as a question for the group here, how much, what is the vision for folks here for affinity groups to really be emerging centers specific. And I don't necessarily even mean like particular to the track, but to be a spaces that are for campuses with emerging RCD capabilities.
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that question by going back a couple slides. So this came out of the idea that we want to make sure that emerging centers feel like they're part of the club, right? So that's really where this is all coming from. So does it have to be exclusive to emerging centers? I don't think so. And in fact, I don't think we really want that, because I think there's things we learned from folks that have come before us, right? And that have advanced and that have graduated from the emerging centers name, whatever that means. So I think there should be a space for emerging centers in these groups, and I think that they should be an active participant. And we need to make sure that the conversation doesn't get overwhelmed and pushed away from the topic areas that are of concern to emerging centers. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, and my follow-up question is, for this group then, as you're thinking about capitalizing on presence at these other events, at REN events, et cetera, what you think would be necessary to make sure that there is a sufficient place for emerging centers, institutions to feel like they're at the table? What's the framing? What, does it need to be a specific little session or time to get together to make sure that campuses with emerging RCD capabilities have a space at that event? So that's kind of my question. And I think that in terms like the operational approach.
One way I think is the ask me anything kind of thing, because I think some people either serendipitously find it, or there is increasing questions, and then how do I even solve this? So I think for my part of the journey, I just sort of fell into it and like, okay, how do I get resources? How do I do that? And I leveraged NiserNet and the REN to engage at a level that otherwise my college would have never been. I mean, I was the one little public liberal arts college in a room of 11 R1s. No way would I be there otherwise. So I think this is one where it's the inviting table that says, hey, do you have a lot of people asking you like the questions about these kinds of things? And I think that's part where talking to my colleagues when I was in that state, they didn't even know these things existed. So I think that might be another avenue. This is the, have you had these kinds of questions? We might have people that can help you out, kind of thing.
Yeah, we may want to consider the idea of almost like a mentoring, emerging centers mentoring, somebody who's been in and around it for a while, who's willing to like take somebody or an institution who's really new and has no idea what's going on. Like they know they need it, they don't know what to do. And a lot of institutions I've spoken to have shied away from engaging or even taking on an RCD journey because they don't know where to start, they don't know where to go, and they're afraid to ask the questions because they're how do I go into a room full of R1s and ask a question and not sound like, I'm completely clueless and stupid and don't know where I am? You can do one of two things. You can have somebody invite you in that's kind of like hey, stick with me, I'll help you get through, I'll make the introductions, I'll do that, almost like they do like when they do a lot in colleges, like where, somebody like almost like the RA or somebody like that is kind of helping you with your community or build it a little bit. Or you could just kind of do, most of you that know me knows I'm a shrinking violet and I'm unwilling to walk into any place and say anything. I literally just showed up at meetings that I wasn't invited to and just started participating. I'm the oddball in there that I'm not afraid to go in and say, I don't know anything, but teach me. Whereas other people may need that invite. And so those of us that have done and kind of made connections can make all sorts of introductions for people and make them feel a little bit more welcome. And, you know, say, hey, 5 years ago, like I had no idea what the heck I was doing, you know, and this is how we did it, and go from there. Sometimes it's the Ren. If the Ren is good, they'll be able to help you. Other times, you know, if people are completely cast out, they have no idea where to even go. They're even afraid to approach their Ren.
Yeah. So Michael, I agree, but I'm gonna push back on the mentoring thing a little bit, and I think there's a place for a mentoring program here, and that has been suggested by other folks. That's not this though, and the reason why I say that is because we also heard that there's a definite need for not feeling like you're a lesser, right? And in mentoring, there's always a protege, and then there's the mentor. And we don't want that kind of like level differential relationship in this in what we're talking about here today. So I do think that like a mentoring program might be something to look at into the future, but that is not what we intend for these affinity groups. This is serving a very different purpose than that mentoring thing. This is more of a peer relationship. And that was stressed to us quite heavily at that BoF that mentoring is not what we're talking about for this effort. It's a peer relationship. And I understand why they feel that way. So I want to respect that.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes left. I want to get to the last slide. This has been a great conversation though. So last thing that we thought about was community. And so we are going to get through this today, you know, but if you have any ideas after I go through this quick, feel free to fire me off an email. So the other thing is community, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit with Lauren's questions about, you know, EC's role and like what the community looks like. But, you know, one thing is like, how inclusive do we want these affinity groups to be? We don't want them to be like, so there's a feeling amongst the EC community that things get kind of taken over by R1s because they have resources. They often have a little bit more time to dedicate to things like this. We want to make sure that this doesn't become like something that the EC start and the R1s take over because it's a really good idea. We want to make sure this is something that sticks, you know, and stays relevant to the EC community. So how do we kind of how do we keep that community intact, right? And so this is kind of setting boundaries, right? So do we have size limits on these affinity groups? I mean, that seems very heavy-handed. But we do want to limit the number of R1s in the group in a sense that we want to make sure that they don't dominate the conversation and take it over. So do we do that by adjusting the leadership of the group, making sure that the leadership is within the EC community? That's one idea. But this is kind of a hairy question, right? So we definitely want to think about how we structure these to make sure that these affinity groups stay EC oriented. Expectations and principles for the discussion. So, you know, the idea is that these are really informal, but we don't want to like say, well, you can't have speakers because it might be a really good reason for you to bring in somebody that, you know, has some expertise. So it'd be nice to provide, I think, some guidance to these affinity groups in a sense as to like how to kind of manage the meetings, how to like invite speakers and things to talk about, maybe, you know, typical agendas or formats for discussion. So I think there's something we can do around like setting expectations for how these operate. And I put this last comment in there because again, you know, I don't think we want to be super heavy-handed about how they work. Like the idea is to kind of find a critical mass, put them together, and then just let them go. So it's less about finding hard solutions and more about kind of giving folks a nudge on the journey to creating these affinity groups. And that's the last point that I was trying to make in that last bullet. So any more thoughts on community?
Well, I think it is sort of that code of conduct kind of thing, because as we've discussed, even R1s may be emerging because they're rebooting or, you know, bringing on another, you know, doubling their size or whatever. So I think it may be sort of stating well, you can't necessarily just buy your way out of it, or trying to set the game of, what if you didn't have money, or what if you didn't have staff? What if you, so putting the parameters around the box so that it's sort of on the level of the table, right? And, I think to your point, there may be R1 affinity groups because they're dealing with bigger things of, oh, now we're getting taxed on, the endowment. Now what are we going to do kinds of things. So, but I think maybe it's framing a good code of conduct for the affinity group that sort of states the game.
Kirk's going beyond with the code of conduct, what I had written in bullet point 8. And if he stole that from bullet point 8, that's fine. But that's been my take on it for a year or two of, and I hadn't exactly thought about it in terms of what I wrote there in terms of, if the R1 people, have some spare time to figure out, basically what Kirk said of how would you do this if you didn't have all the resources you have available and what you're used to, Tony Stark with his, box of scraps in a cave sort of thing.
Yeah, the other thing I've always thought about is, when you're building chip wafers, you need that seed crystal. So sometimes it's bringing in the R1s to say, if you had the absolute minimum resources, what are the absolute critical minimum value product, critical path kind of things? Because I think that's sometimes of boiling down complex solutions to the critical scaffolding that's needed for solving the problem.
Agreed. Yeah.
I've done exercises in the past of how do I bootstrap from nothing to like full configuration management. And the thing is it makes you go back and figure out all the things that you had that you just sort of either assumed already existed or they existed, but they weren't managed. They were just sort of, they just sort of grew into being somewhat managed. And it's an exercise.
Yeah, a purposeful build, I think is sort of that using hindsight, what could we have done better kind of thing, or in an ideal world, but well, we can't implement the perfect solution. So how can we, what are the corners we have to cut, want to cut, kind of thing.
And in my example with like data management, if the answer is go to Glacier or Azure Cold, okay, cool. We have never done that before. What can facilitate that in terms of open source tools or artisanal Python scripts, take your pick, that makes that accessible. And maybe part of it too is how do you build that out to the individuals, because like small places have probably never done anything resembling chargeback before. And they will get swamped by it if they think and maybe they're going to need it maybe at some point, or they're going to need some financial sustainability. But how do you go from a thing you do in your spare time to this is now a thing I got to get investors on?
So I think another piece is what are the critical staff resources or staff skills that are needed to make these things happen? We've gone through that of the army of one to, okay, you need to support 400 researchers. How are you going to do that? How many people? What is the order of events for building that out kind of thing?
Setting expectations for that critical mass of people that you can't get, I'm not going to support literally 400 PI. Well, we don't have 400 PIs to begin with, but you can't do 400 individual calls with 2 people.
Well, thanks all. We're at the top of the hour. I want to respect everyone's time. So thanks everyone for the great discussion. We've taken some great notes. And we'll go back and discuss this, and we'll engage the community once again, once we have some time to process all this. So thanks everyone again for the discussion, and we'll see you in April again for our first origin story.